Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be taking a look at legal institutions in the United States and in many areas of the world. My guest today is an expert on this topic. My guest today is Judge Thomas Moukawsher, who is a Connecticut complex litigation judge and former lawyer, legislator, and lobbyist. He's the author of The Common Flaw, Needless Complexity in the Courts and 50 Ways to Reduce It. He recently authored various articles on the Supreme Court's immunity ruling and what it means for the Nuremberg principles. Judge Thomas Moukawsher, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Very much, Bill. Good to be here.
We've got so many different angles to start on. I don't know where to start. So let's start with your book. Are there one or two items in your recent book that would apply to what many scholars today is a constitutional crisis that we have in this country? But are there one or two items that you wanted to mention to get us into it? Because we've got so many different approaches that we could go in a multitude of directions.
Sure, I'd be glad to. The book is really a compilation of things I learned on the bench. I've retired from the bench now and have tried to summarize those things in the book. And it's about dealing with complicated assaults on the legal system. The book really is a face-up to the challenges that have come to the courts over the years, from the volume of litigation, the complexity of litigation, and frankly, the tactics that are used by a lot of litigants today who are trying to, unfortunately, delegitimize the courts. And so there are 50 points in the book, and many of them are aimed at preventing people from tying up the system in knots. And clearly, that's what's going on now, because in some of the cases that are pending regarding the Trump administration, attacks have been made against the judges directly. And in my book, I advocate that courts have to take those on and not defer them, not send them off to somebody else, but make actual decisions about those things to make them fairly, make them efficiently, and make them stick. Because what parties are trying to do in many of these cases is simply slow things down. So first of all, they have to sweep attacks out of the way when those attacks are made on the judges. And second of all, they've got to manage the litigation. And a lot of what's going on right now is about how the litigation is going to be managed. Because as you may have seen from the news, a lot of the attacks in the courts have been on temporary orders. And so the courts make temporary orders that are going to last while they hear the case. Well, if the case lasts 4 years, the temporary orders are permanent. And so my book is about showing how to deal with those temporary orders right up front, but also about not making the case last 4 years so that the parties actually get answers to their questions. But that dynamic is very much part of these cases that are pending regarding the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for decades, for eons now, as far back as I can remember anyway, we've always touted ourselves as being a country of the rule of law. That seems to have changed quite dramatically over the last 10 months or less, I should say. I just take one example. Our Borders, our fellow named Tom Homan, said that he did not care, unquote, about U.S. District Judge James Boasberg's opinion in a deportation case. Basically, as I read it, he's saying, well, we're going to do what we want to do. We don't care what the judge says. How do we reconcile that?
When I saw that, a sharp pain went up my back. I can tell you, it's a scary thing for someone to say words like those. And unfortunately, it's typical of many of the people who surround President Trump that they say one thing one moment and then say something the other moment. So the president himself has said, we'll follow court rulings. Homan said other things that are more ambiguous than that. But, they have to be careful about the message they're sending to the general public. And that message has been to try to delegitimize the courts. We're going to ignore you. We're going to impeach you. We're going to do these things because you're not following the law. We are. And these things just are so far from the truth that they threaten democracy if we don't make the rule of law stick.
Exactly. No doubt about it. I guess it was about a year and a half ago. Well, you would know exactly, but when the Supreme Court came out and said, basically gave the president who at that time was Joe Biden. It wasn't Donald Trump, but it said that the president had immunity to, I can't say exactly, but to do almost anything that he wanted to do, legally do it. How does that factor into where we are today and the philosophy that's motivating many of the Trump people? And what do you think the Supreme Court thinks about that today? As they look in the rear view mirror.
The what that decision actually means is still being fought over. And of course, the Trump administration and the president himself wants it to mean that he can do anything he wants and there'll be no consequences from them. But the court didn't really go that far. The court was a little ambiguous in some parts of it. It needs to fill in those gaps. But basically, the president has certain core official acts. And under this, he's criminally and civilly immune from being sued for the decisions he makes on those. So, for instance, his recent decision to bomb the Houthis is a core presidential act. The use of military power under those circumstances is just not reviewable by any court in the United States. Similarly, the pardon power was held a core presidential function. You can't question why a president decided to give a pardon. And another thing is the discussions of prosecutions that take place between the attorney general and the president were found to be absolutely immune from scrutiny in criminal or civil court. But then there are other acts that might be official that are sort of on the edge of the president's power, maybe some of the things that he says at a news conference or other things that might that might come in for scrutiny. And then there's the whole other realm of unofficial acts. The president cannot do things to profit himself personally. The president cannot do things that hurt other people personally, just because, for instance, the president has a personal reason to dislike them. So unofficial acts aren't protected. And where the court draws the line between what's official and what's unofficial is going to be critical. And I think that the wheels are turning in the minds of the Supreme Court justices about drawing that line a little more carefully, even as we speak.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the main question that comes up after these arguments have been put up by conservative and liberal constitutional, really philosophers, come right down to it, people who study these issues, study the Constitution, and the question comes up, what if Donald Trump refuses to obey the Supreme Court ruling?
And that's the $50,000 question. I wrote an article for Newsweek on that very subject, which I felt like mailing to all the judges with these cases. Something I had to deal with is people, what do you do when you make an order and nobody responds to it? And the judges have a number of powers. A judge could start with holding a hearing on a motion for contempt. Mm-hmm. They could bring in the people from the administration who were responsible for carrying out those policies and ask them why they shouldn't be held in contempt. So, for instance, if a certain amount of money is owed to a specific agency and they refuse to give it, you say, I'm going to give you one more chance to give it. And you're the person who has to sign off on doing this, right? And the answer is yes. And this is kind of the extreme end of it. The court has the power to simply jail that person until they change their mind about sending the money that they're supposed to send. It's the last thing a judge wants to do, but it's incredibly powerful. But there are other things the court can do as well. Fines are an example. So you take the individuals who aren't doing what the court ordered, and you say to them, every day you don't obey the court order, you're going to be fined X thousands of dollars. And it depends, and this is what I wrote in my article, it depends on who you're dealing with. $1,000 a day fine to Elon Musk would have no impact whatsoever on action. But if you get $11 million a day fine, it can really add up someday. So courts can do that. And then the question was asked, well, don't these things have to be collected by the U.S. Marshal Service? And can't Trump, because it's in the executive branch, if we tell the U.S. Marshal Service not to do it, don't arrest this person, don't collect the fine against that person. That's all well and good for 4 years. But if you have fines developing and interest growing on at the end of the 4 years, the next administration may well direct the U.S. Marshal Service to collect that money. And then it could be millions of dollars that you know. So a person defying a court order has to decide, am I going to risk personal bankruptcy to do what Donald Trump tells me, or should I do what the court orders me to do? And I think that would have some impact on people. And by the way, this incarceration and the rest of it is all non-criminal. So Trump couldn't pardon these people either.
Mhm. That has to be rumbling around in the minds of the people who are involved in this. And we're going to get back in a moment and talk about just that and talk about how we're being viewed internationally. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we are looking at what many people refer to as the constitutional crisis in the United States, which has an impact not only in this country, but really around the world to some degree. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Judge Thomas Moukawsher is a Connecticut complex litigation judge and former lawyer, legislator, and lobbyist. His most recent book is The Common Flaw, Needless Complexity in the Courts and 50 Ways to Reduce It. Judge, we were talking about the what a lot of people think is a constitutional crisis, and I say Trump supporters and people who aren't Trump supporters feel that way too. Many of them do to a large degree, but also what we do in this country resonates around the world. The U.S., the legal system, as I understand it, has really been a leader in the rule of law, in promoting democracy and working with other countries to set up legitimate legal systems that are not banana republic, strong arm leaders who just do what they want to do. But how is the dysfunctional aspects that are taking place right now, how do they impact, let's say, international groups like the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court or United Nations human rights treaties, different groups like that. How does this resonate in other parts of the legal system in other parts of the world?
Well, the bedrock for American success has always been our stability of our currency, and that currency is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, and the United States is backed by the rule of law. And there's actually a chapter in my book, The Common Flaw, about this, because I would compare the Constitution of the United States with the Constitution of Russia. They have a much better constitution than we do. It's a pleasure to read. It promises all kinds of things, but they're empty promises is the problem. They don't mean a thing. And we have a system.
Or like campaign promises.
Yeah, it's preposterous because in Russia, there is no rule of law. And what that means for a country where the rule of law starts to break down, as with Russia, you lead to totalitarianism, you lead to reckless foreign policy. But more important for the tradition of the United States is that nobody wants to do business with you anymore. Because if your country and your legal system aren't stable, why are you going to put your money there? When you put your money into, let's say it's, someone who's a real player and is about to invest billions of dollars in a country, what if they think that they're going to go there only to be stuck up by the president of the United States for cash? And this sort of thing is happening. The president is pressuring various groups for money, some of it for the United States, and frankly, I think some of it for himself. And if that's the kind of country you're going to go into, the kind of oligarchy that Russia has, nobody wants to do business with you. And international organizations are going to shun you, from the legal system that governs much of the world. And so we'll be as isolated as countries like Russia and North Korea, et cetera. And that's the consequences couldn't be graver, because once people lose faith in us, they're going to lose faith in the dollar. They're going to lose faith in doing business with us. And obviously, as you know, from what's going on with what's been said against Europe and what's been said in favor of Russia, that our friends won't trust and stand by us militarily or politically.
And you hit the right word, stability. You have to have that. Businesses have to have it. Most governments have to have it. The voters need it. They want it. But that's absolutely true. While we're talking internationally, how do you think it's being perceived? I know you don't live in Europe or Asia or whatever, but you recall, as I do, studying history, we remember the bad old days of gunboat diplomacy down in the South America and the Caribbean, with the United States, might makes right type of approach. We see now that same philosophy is possibly going to be applied against the country of Panama, and getting the Panama Canal back, as they say. The other thing is this manifest destiny, Andrew Jackson and the movement to the West. Now there's a movement to incorporate Canada as our 51st state. How is this viewed? First off, is it legal to do this? I guess if Congress passed it, it might be, but it would still be just an absolute international time bomb, come right down to it. The other countries of the world would not accept it. And if they did, it would be begrudgingly. But how do you perceive these two concepts of how Trump administration's talked about taking Canada and Greenland too?
Well, obviously, there are international protocols that we used to respect. There are international treaties and international norms that we used to respect, and we founded most of them, that would make these things unlawful. But the United States in recent years, not just with the Trump administration, but the George W. Bush administration too, just shows scorn for international law and for international norms. And the Trump administration has ratcheted that up very high. So while there'll be clearly the case to be made that these things are under international law illegal, the United States would take the position that it doesn't matter, because we don't follow any of the things that these international bodies tell us to do anymore. As for being legal in the United States, I mean, what worries me is that during the so-called war on terror, we passed a lot of legislation that expands the president's right to stomp out terror. And so you start to see words like terror and terrorist being tortured into being things that they're not. And so is an attack on the Panama Canal going to be justified by the laws of the war on terror? If they're not covered by that, obviously the Congress has the power to declare war, not the President of the United States. And even with the Republicans in charge of both the House and the Senate, I can't imagine them voting to go to war with Panama or war with Canada or Greenland. And at least the latter two, in the case of Canada and Greenland, there are other binding legal obligations that affect that too. One, which is in particular NATO. Our obligations to NATO would mean that we're supposed to actually defend Canada and Greenland against attack. But if we're the attackers ourselves, presumably those places would and certainly should invoke the rights they have under the NATO agreements to be protected from that kind
Exactly. Well, we all need to get our history books and go back and read how the United States basically contrived the Mexican-American War, because we wanted to steal the Southwest from Mexico, contrived the Spanish-American War because we wanted to steal other areas, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a variety of other places from Spain. And look at our history and see a lot of it's being repeated today. It's just incredible, especially with this. Well, I won't go into great detail. We're just about out of time, but let me ask you in our last 2 minutes, if you were advising Democrats, Republicans, the Trump administration, what would you recommend to them as to how we can deal with this constitutional crisis in a more orderly fashion and a more legal fashion?
Well, I'd recommend that Republicans, Democrats, and the judiciary stand up to the Trump administration, because the Trump administration is the problem, and convincing them to follow the rule of law and to respect that we have 3 equal branches of government is imperative. And yes, I think the courts are doing their job in doing that. I think Congress has to step up to the plate and make it clear that it's going to perform its functions as a counterbalance to the executive. And there's been too much reluctance on the part of the leaders in Congress to make it very clear that they're an equal branch of government. So I'd want that to, it's the 3 branches, each of them standing in the place of the power that they're supposed to have and not encroaching on each other. Those are the things that everybody should agree with, because maybe there'll be a Democratic regime after this Republican one that Republicans won't want to have authoritarian powers. It's in all of our interests.
Exactly. And we really need to be aware of how we're being damaged internally and externally, and how our prestige is sinking like a rock overseas. It's just, people think, oh, this is just wonderful, glorious. We're going to find waste, fraud, and abuse, which they've not found very much waste, fraud, and abuse at all up to this point. And if they have some, they need to prove it, which they have not done in most cases. Now, in some cases, they said they have. But anyway, these are the issues that we're going to be dealing with, and we have to really focus on these and to learn more about history, in my opinion. But Judge Thomas Moukawsher, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure being on with you.
Thank you. My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.